Sego, it is April 20th. Yeah, it's 420. It's 420, so we'll talk about that. But I want to welcome to Let's Talk Native on the LTN Radio Network. This program breaks all the rules for Native radio. No buffalo speeches, no mystic healing, no special Indian prayers. We tackle the real issues facing Native people with a look back at our glorious and our grave history. A tough look at where we're at now and a look forward to our ongoing battles for sovereignty and autonomy. Let's Talk Native is produced in association with Iroquois Promotions on the LTN Radio Network, streaming live from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. And we are simulcast and rebroadcast on the Gwe, that's CKWE in Tandanega. You can find our audio streaming live and in a loop when we're not live at www.ltnradionet.com. And of course, we are Facebook Live. I've been struggling a little bit. I had a couple of glitches in my camera system that acted up when I was in New York last week. So if you looked at my last video from New York, you can see that it wasn't quite what we usually do. So, but we fixed that problem, and so we should be fine today. I am John Kane, I'm the show's host and producer, and look, I'm happy to be here, and I'm glad for those of you who are tuning us in again on our live stream, audio stream, and our video stream. Got a couple of interesting things to talk about. Like I said, it is 420, so I do think we need to have a bit of a conversation about marijuana, about cannabis, about legalization, not just medicinally but recreationally. I think it's and there are plenty of other people having a conversation. So it wouldn't be proper for me not to weigh in a little bit on this. So I will do that. But I want to talk about something else. I posted something yesterday on my train ride home from New York, and what I posted was, I honestly I have to ask to be excused for not remembering who had posted it originally, but I posted the audio of Malcolm X, and it was the speech that he gave where he laid out the difference between a field Negro and a house Negro. Now, I saw it posted, and I've heard excerpts of that before, but I never heard what this was, and this was like a full 25-minute video. So it is on my group page. I think I have got it on the Let's Talk Native page. So feel free to check it out. I listened to it, and I listened to it thoroughly. Now, look, I understand that a lot of people viewed Malcolm X through the lens of militancy. He never called for an armed revolution. What he oftentimes talked about was not tolerating violence being perpetrated against black people, and frankly, hitting back. That's really what he advocated, and beyond just hitting back. His view was that if you're going to kill me, I'm going to kill you, and look, I know people, like to promote this idea of peaceful demonstrations and prayer circles and all that other stuff, but there comes a time that you got to fight back. And so as Malcolm was talking about this distinction between the house Negro and the field Negro, it punched me in the gut, because look, there's no way that if you listen to Malcolm X's speech on this, you can't make the analogy to the varying views or the diverse views that are held by Native people. The ones who are very pro, let's say, Democratic Party, or very pro-military, or very pro-church, versus the ones who say, no, that wasn't who we are. That's not our system. That's not our way. Those who are very pro-elective system, or the ones who say, get out and vote in the American elections, versus those who say, no, we are sovereign. I mean, and look, I know that I've got more of the Malcolm X view from a Native perspective than the Martin Luther King view. But, I could have played the speech, but I'd rather you take the time to hear it and listen to it on your own, because I'm going to talk about it a little bit here. But I think if you take his whole premise and then you apply it to not just the difference between those who view the United States as their country, and I mean Native people, versus those who say, no, I'm not an American, I'm not a part of that system. You really can break it down. And I went far enough to say, look, if you're Native and if you think Donald Trump is your president, I called it out. I said, you're a house Negro. If you enlist in the armed forces of the U.S. or Canada and then call yourself a warrior because of that, yeah, I said it. I said, you're a house Negro. Because you have taken on your master as your champion. And that's the view. Look, I know it's harsh, and there are people, I had people post me immediately saying, you know what, you're going to turn off an awful lot of people there. You're calling out a lot of people. And I said, yeah, I'm probably calling all of us. I mean, all of us have compromised ourselves at least a little bit. And some maybe more than a little bit, and some all the way. There are very, very assimilated people, black people included, and that's what Malcolm X was calling out. He was calling out Martin Luther King and the Gang of Six, or what he called the Big Six in terms of the national leadership. And as he was talking about those guys, I got to tell you, I started thinking about the same thing for Native people. We have those iconic figures that have been propped up by the White House or by church organizations or civic organizations, and basically by white people. And, look, I'm not going to I could rattle off like an Oren Lyons or a Sherman Alexie or even Winona LaDuke. And I know people are going to say, oh, how could you? But you know what? If you see a person of color who is being propped up by the non-people of color, I mean, the establishment, you've got to question why. And that's what Malcolm X was saying. I mean, he talked about the March on Washington and how that was a grassroots movement, and that Kennedy went to the Big Six, including MLK, and said, you guys have to stop that. And those guys said, we can't. We could no sooner stop it than we could start it. We had nothing to do with starting this. And so Kennedy said, well, you may not have been a part of it, but you're gonna be. And so, and we could debate whether Kennedy was saying we're going to plug you into that March on Washington to subvert it, or whether he felt like, and again, I know people have mixed feelings about this, and I'm not giving him a pass, but whether he thought that a March on Washington shouldn't happen without those prominent leaders, we could debate that. But the fact of the matter is, he wanted to get those spiritual, those passive, those peaceful protesting guys, those guys who said, oh no, let's not fight back. Let's demonstrate. And that's what he did. And so Malcolm X's point is, yeah, those people showed up. They knew what time to show up in Washington. They knew what signs to carry. They knew what songs to sing. They knew what chants to chant. And they knew to get out of town before sunset. That's how orchestrated and how controlled the March on Washington turned out to be when it occurred. And, of course, the big voices were the voices you expect. The national figures are the ones who spoke. Now, I know, the John Lewises and some of the other folks, would cringe at the notion of promoting what Malcolm X had to say on this issue, and especially the idea of cutting the legs out of MLK. But let's be clear, Martin Luther King, especially since his death, has been completely appropriated by American history. And now he's like this iconic, this American hero. He wasn't exactly the hero at the time, but he's become that. So when he talks about when MLK was, or when Malcolm X was actually talking about these leaders, that were already becoming more and more embraced by the establishment, I had to reflect on Standing Rock. Standing Rock was a grassroots movement, and it got completely subverted by some of these iconic figures. I mean, Onondaga said not only did Oren Lyons and those guys weigh in on it, and they had their own little marches in Onondaga and Syracuse, but they sent Joe Heath out there. And when I look at some of these people who showed up at Standing Rock, including Dave Archambault, the tribal chairman of the Standing Rock Sioux, and the way that he tried to take control of the situation, even to the extent of trying to send people home and calling for people to leave, celebrating when Obama in the 11th hour, didn't end it, but to put the brakes on a little bit. Yeah, suspended the completion of the thing, and then praised him like somehow he was the redeemer here. And in the end, there was no question this can was going to get kicked into Donald Trump, and I'm not letting Donald Trump off the hook. I mean, Donald Trump is a joke, but Donald Trump didn't build the Dakota Access Pipeline. That was built during the Obama administration, and so when you look at how, I mean, let's face it, the Dakota Access Pipeline, Standing Rock, and water protectors, and all that no DAPL stuff. That was the closest thing that Native people have had to Birmingham and Washington, and the kind of stuff that Black people did during the Civil Rights Movement. It was the closest thing we had, but it still didn't compare. I mean, the only reason it compared is because our population is so much smaller. But I'll tell you, we had an awful lot of white people out there in Standing Rock, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing, because I think we do need allies. But there were white people who were stealing the spotlight. Amy Goodman and Jill Stein. I mean, you had not just white people; you had other people like Jesse Jackson showing up out there. You had people that were capitalizing on this thing when it started to gain some attention. And of course, many of the activists. I mean, the poor girl who got her arm blown off. That was a white girl that almost had her arm blown off from New York City. And again, I'm not condemning those people who lent. I mean, what was the Shailene Woodley, the actress, right? That's another one who stepped up. I mean, there were a lot of people who made news with this thing. But again, you got when you break this thing down, you realize here in Seneca Territory, as much as people will talk about what we did in the 90s, blocking the thruway and everything else, you bring up blocking the thruway now. I'm sure the Seneca Nation's suing the state over the thruway, but there has been this constant drumbeat of, don't go on the thruway. You go on that thruway, and the United States is going to charge you with an act of terror. They're going to use the Patriot Act. They're going to use their anti-terrorism laws, and they're going to lock you up in a cage in Guantanamo Bay. You know what? And I took this attitude. I've said it before. If I go and support the Seneca people, and I'm not going to lead this thing, because again, this is Seneca territory, and I know that the best thing I can do is support what people are doing. But if I was one of the people going onto that thruway, because that's what the decision was to do so, not by the nation, but I mean by the people, I would dare those son of a guns to try to throw me in a cage in Guantanamo Bay. Because to me, if there anybody who suggests that the Patriot Act was an abuse of power, there would have been no more visible a demonstration of that abuse of power if they used it against Native people on their own land. And keep in mind, the thruway is Seneca land, and the idea that somebody would dare accuse or try to use an anti-terrorism law against Senecas, trying to fight for their own rights, and a lot of those rights are tied to the state's unfettered access, through Seneca territory for their commerce, and actually turning the thruway into that land, that 300 acres plus acres, into a commercial enterprise all by itself, versus the state trying to kill our enterprises. I mean, there's a strong argument that could be made for Senecas once again going out on the thruway, especially now that the Senecas have brought suit against it. And Eric White's activity notwithstanding. I mean, Eric White is one of those guys who has felt a pinch from the state trying to interfere with native-to-native commerce. And the fact that he's drawn a little attention by pushing some dirt around next to the thruway, hey, more power to him as far as I'm concerned. But, again, full disclosure, Eric White's one of my sponsors. But I would be taking this position whether he was or whether he wasn't. I mean, and I think anybody who listens to the show would know that's the case. So, but it's interesting. And again, I think it's really worth listening to the Malcolm X speech on this House Negro versus Field Negro. Even the idea that, the House Negro, if he was ever asked, to escape or to leave the house, to run away, he would say, why would I want to leave this? Look, and there's a lot of Native people who say, why would I want to fight against the United States? I mean, when, it's the land of milk and honey, and it's, follow the American dream. I mean, there's a lot of Native people who have that view. So, and he actually took it farther. He says, the difference between the House Negro and the Field Negro is when that house catches on fire, that House Negro, he's working harder to put that fire out than the master is. He's hauling buckets of water. He's having his hair singed off and his skin singed off his body, trying to put that house fire out. While the field Negro is standing back saying, let it burn. Let it burn. In fact, while it's burning, I might get my butt out of here. So that's the difference. So as I look at even the current circumstance, I mean, how many Native people are saying, oh, yeah, we need to impeach Trump? I don't need to impeach Trump. I didn't elect that son of a gun. I didn't elect him. In fact, there's a certain part of me that says, I'm glad, the American people got exactly what they deserved in Donald Trump. And again, going back to MLK, and I talked about this on the show, he told Harry Belafonte at one time, towards the end, he said, I fear I am trying to integrate my people into a burning house. So he was already seeing so many of the flaws, in the Vietnam War and other things that were going on. He saw a lot of reasons that he was very, very concerned about his people being more prominent in the system, seeing how flawed the system was. And that's what I say about our people. We have a unique opportunity because, look, even if you don't live on territory, if you're really Native, then you have a territory that you're tied to, that you're connected to. You have a people, right? So because you have that, I don't care, even if you're living in New York City or San Francisco or Chicago or, Miami, whatever, you still have a people back home. You still have a home. So the idea of asserting sovereignty and asserting our sovereignty and autonomy and our distinction from the United States should not be viewed as, somehow, anti-American, but pro who you are, pro onwe. And it should not be viewed as a rebellious act. It should be viewed, and I'm not a big fan of the word patriotism, but it should be viewed as pride in who you are. We oftentimes hear about, this idea of diversity. And of course, what gets preached in this notion of diversity is tolerance. Look, I don't care if somebody wants to tolerate me or not. I mean, if you hate my guts and you feel like the best that you can do is tolerate me, look, do that for yourself, but don't do that for me. Because if you can't have an exchange of ideas with me and respect me, I'm not saying like me, but if you can't respect that I have a different perspective, and again, I'm not even necessarily condemning the house Negro, okay? I'm not condemning those Native people who are fully assimilated. The problem that I have with the Native people who are so assimilated, who are so indoctrinated into the American system, who couldn't even fathom the idea of real decolonization, is them standing in the way of those of us who do. That's where I have the problem. What Malcolm X was condemning wasn't so much the house Negro for his loyalty to the master. What he was condemning was the house Negro's role in controlling the field Negro, in playing a role and being the extension and being part of that oppressive system, holding his own people back. That's where I have an issue with those Native people who want to promote, enlistment, and they want to promote their church. They want to promote voting in non-Native elections. They want to promote lobbying, Congress for legislation to help them. Look, if your view is that the federal government can legislate for you, then what you're really saying is they can legislate over you. And again, that's something that I've said many times before. So this is where, if you listened, again, if you're Native and you listen to Malcolm X's speech on the house Negro versus the field Negro, you better feel something. Because if you don't feel something as a Native person, then you're not understanding what Malcolm X is saying. Whether you agree with him or not, there's a certain element of what he says that is undeniable truth. And that loyalty and that patriotism towards your oppressor is exactly what he's talking about in that speech. So you can look it up. I'll make sure that I post or repost it again. It is on my Facebook group page. it's some powerful words, and again, it may cause you to view Martin Luther King in a little different light. And I'm not condemning Martin Luther King, but I'm also I'm not going to condemn those people who say let's all pray for peace. I guess I'm not going to condemn them, but don't let your prayers for peace stop me from engaging in real resistance. Don't get in my way. Is my whole point. And again, I'm not trying to push my way around here on Seneca territory. I mean, as a Mohawk, I'm talking about standing with Mohawks or standing with Senecas, and I'm not trying to be I'm not trying to be a national figure here. I'm, like Malcolm X. I'm also not trying to get myself killed, but all I'm suggesting is that if you're going to immortalize the words of Martin Luther King, you probably should think about immortalizing some of Malcolm X's thoughts, or Muhammad Ali. There was another, what I thought was great voice in not just in the anti-war movement, but in the whole social justice issue. And that becomes the other question. The other question has to do with social justice. Now, look, I don't think to be a black man, and I talked about this in a roundtable discussion with my friend Nolan Hack the other day. We talked about identity and how do you identify somebody as legitimately black or legitimately native. And the tendency is to talk about those people of color who have fought for social justice. That's not the only measure of somebody's identity. I think there are many people within the black community and within the native communities that are bastions of cultural depth that may not be in the front lines of a protest or resistance. I don't think the role of everybody in a society is to be the fighter. Some people, the musicians that I play, I opened up with Resignation from Pappy John's band. But I mean, music is an important part of a culture. So whether that musician is willing to, pick up a sign or a club or a bat or a rock or, a gun, doesn't mean that I think that they're not Indian enough. They're not native enough. And the same thing with other people of color. I don't think resistance is the only measure of a person. And I mean man or woman. I don't think resistance is the only, and then how you interpret resistance is also another issue, because I think a person who can use music or art or poetry or language. I mean, those people who are fighting to preserve our language, those people are just as important as anybody who's willing to spill out onto the thruway, and they don't have to be the same people. In fact, you know what? If you have some other gift, then maybe that gift shouldn't. Maybe you should protect that gift and that place that you're playing in your society, in your culture, in your community. Let those of us who have less to offer, I guess, but perhaps a little bit of physical resistance, step out onto the thruway. And again, I'm not trying to make a big deal about the thruway. I just mean in general. I mean, whether it's stopping a pipeline or dumping in a fracking wastewater into our river, or contamination from a nuclear power plant or nuclear power storage facility. I mean, look, there are people whose diplomatic skills, and this is, again, one of my criticisms that I see amongst people of color. We oftentimes look for the most educated, frankly, the most indoctrinated people amongst us to be our leadership. Oh, those people who are so skilled that they're lawyers. Oh, such and such is a native lawyer. Yeah, but what laws is he committed to? What laws has he sworn allegiance to become, to pass the bar association and to practice law? I mean, that's a legitimate question. And so, do we actually look at the grassroots people? I mean, right now is the first week of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is wrapping up, and there's another week next week. I've heard some good voices, on some of the people who have done some, their interventions down there. But you know what happens? It's the same people, the people who earn $15,000 for a speaking engagement, that are showing up down in New York. It's the same voices that get heard every year at that thing. Some of them. I mean, like I said, we're hearing some new voices. But at some point, it isn't just the people who make it in to sit in at, in the hallowed halls of the UN that need to be heard. There are some grassroots people that need to be heard. That's what was so engaging and exciting to me about what began at Standing Rock, and which really shouldn't have been focused on Standing Rock. I mean, even if Standing Rock was the reason, and I said this about the Oka crisis coming out of in 1990. We didn't need to go to Oka. We could have resisted the U.S. and Canada in our own territories. I've heard some wise people say, look, if we're under the gun in one Native community, we should do something in our own Native communities to show solidarity. And there are many acts of civil disobedience that could be happening, not just blocking the thruway, but there are many forms of civil disobedience, and frankly, some things that would probably go beyond civil disobedience. Some things that they could lead to a arrest. Some things are worth getting arrested for. Some things are worth fighting for. And as terrible as it sounds from a person who I think I'm a person of peace, sometimes things are worth killing for or dying for. I take that back. I don't think anything is worth dying for, because I think the idea of accepting the end of your life for a cause. I mean, some poor guy down in New York City last week, down in Prospect Park, who was a lawyer and an activist for environment and I think LGBT issues, felt like in his last effort to demonstrate against the environmental issues, he doused himself with with gasoline or some liquid, flammable liquid, and burnt himself up in Prospect Park in Brooklyn. And he did it as a symbol and as an act of resistance against climate change and and all of that stuff. And look, I will never embrace something, an act like that, and it saddens me to think that somebody became so desperate and desperately committed to a cause that they would feel like taking their life in such a manner was the only way. Look, I don't believe in suicide. I can, and I can never, I mean, other than, hospice or some end of life, disease or something, a terminal disease, the idea of committing suicide as a way to demonstrate your, discontent with the world or your family or whatever else, I don't support that. I think as long as you have a breath to breathe, there is some good work that you can do, and I think we all have to find our place in that. And again, so I'm not apologizing for for posting the Malcolm X speech or for using the expressions that he used in terms of the house Negro versus the field Negro in an analogy to native territories. I think we have to reflect on that and give it some consideration ourselves. Hey, look, we're at the bottom of the hour. When we come back, I'm going to talk about today. It's 420. I'm going to talk about marijuana and cannabis and what other people are saying about it. So we're going to talk about that when we come back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. We'll be right back.
How many tears must we cry? promise is broken. How many more little white lies? Little white lies. Little white lies. Little white lies. Little white lies. Keep on telling me your little white lies. Keep on telling me your little white lies. Teach your children in the classroom English history. What do they teach about the Indians? Took us prisoner in your fight to be free. Little white lies. Little white lies. Little white lies. Little white lies. Keep on telling me.
Yeah, lots of little white lies, and some that are not so little, but still white. All right. Look, a couple of things. Let me go ahead and thank my sponsors. I want to thank Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses, Eric White and ERW Enterprises, and my latest, continuous sponsor is Legacy 420 in Tandanega. And for those who don't know what Legacy 420 is, in spite of its name, it is a cannabis dispensary in Tandanega, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But I also let me continue with my thanks. I want to thank my good friends like Ed Schindler and Cynthia Trice and Neville Spring for supporting what I do. And I also want to thank others. I mean, and in fact, I see a few people even catching the audio and the video today on Facebook Live. I want to thank those of you who have helped me in the past. I really do appreciate it. Sure, I wish we still had the level of support from some of those guys who advertised on the show when we were on commercial radio. But you know what? If you guys weren't there, we wouldn't be here today. We're entering our 8th year, and we couldn't have done it without especially those businesses here in Cattaraugus, and in Tonawanda. I mean, that's where most of my support came from to cover my my airtime on commercial radio. So I want to thank all of you for joining in the fight and doing your part. I mean, I really couldn't be here today. And even the shows that I do in New York, those are possible because of this show. And, so the support that I've got from those folks in the past, that made it possible. Of course, the support that I get from the people currently are what enable me to continue to do what we do. Grow out our studio here, bring things like this, the streaming camera that we have here in studio, and make the trips to New York and do some of the events that I do down there. Look, I'm not one of those guys who gets paid $15,000 for a speaking engagement. Sometimes people invite me down and cover my bus fare or something like that, but I'm not I'm not a headliner. So, and maybe someday I will be, but I'm sure not one right now. So, but also I want to thank folks here at Unity Stream and Apache Radio Net for providing our streaming. I want to thank CKWE for both their simulcast and the rebroadcast of this show. I want to thank Netroots Radio, Real People's Media, and Indigenous Resistance Radio for carrying Let's Talk Native on their networks. And of course, I want to thank all of you who share the show. And, for those of you who listen on Facebook, I know many of you share the Facebook live stream. My wife shares the Facebook live stream, especially while we're live, she does, to a bunch of other Facebook group pages. I share it with a few. But I also know some of you share the SoundCloud audio that I post immediately after the show. And some of you are sharing our YouTube video. We take this video from our Facebook live stream and actually post it up on YouTube, which is actually the best visual experience is watching the show on the YouTube channel, although it's not live, because we edit out that first 15 minutes while I'm scratching my head and posting stuff on my phone. We clean it up a little bit, and the audio and the video is quite good. So those of you who share the YouTube videos from my channel, Let's Talk Native TV on YouTube, and the SoundCloud audio, like I said, and the Facebook live stream, I appreciate all of you doing that. I think what I try to present here is probably a conversation you haven't heard. Again, I know many people are familiar with the speeches from Martin Luther King and some of the speeches from Malcolm X, but mentioning what I mentioned in the first half of the show, I think is important because I think we need to be held to task, and we need to be accountable. We can't just have conversations about sovereignty and decolonization without really reflecting on the work we need to do to assert sovereignty or to decolonize. And I don't look. I think ultimately it is kind of an all or nothing proposition, but it's not like an all or nothing proposition that we need to do. We don't have to fight it on every front. I oftentimes talk about this idea of fighting the house of cards that is the federal Indian law, foundation, and fighting the federal government on its false claims about our subjugation as not crushing that house of cards, but lifting a card off from time to time. Lifting the cards off when we say, no, we want to assert this or we want to assert. I mean, essentially, that's what we did with tobacco and with gas. Our sales of gasoline without New York State taxation. It's what we did with gaming. Gaming isn't legal because the federal government passed the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. It isn't legal because the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Cabazons in a case a year before they passed IGRA. The reason the Supreme Court ruled the way they did is because they have no legal justification for violating the sovereignty of Native people getting involved in gaming. They do have a way of, kind of trimming some of that and chipping away at that sovereignty. I mean, when the Cabazon case was ruled in California, what the Supreme Court ruled when the Cabazons were doing high stakes bingo and the California was trying to stop them, they said, well, if the state is doing gaming and regulating it, then Native people have the right to do gaming that they regulate. Look, that was considered a victory, but think about what the court said. What the court said is, if the state is doing gaming, then we can do it. Well, what if the state isn't doing gaming? Why should the state still have the authority? So, although it was a victory and it laid, it kind of made some people more willing to attempt gaming, especially after it was followed up with the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. But there were people already doing it. There were Mohawk communities that were doing slot machines. There were Seneca territories that had already done had electronic gaming going on, and a variety of other games long before IGRA. And although we had those challenges and those fights with the federal government, I would argue that it was legal before IGRA. The question ends up being, how do we push these issues? And that brings me to what I want to talk about in this part of the show. Look. 420. Today's 420. Everybody associates this date and the number 420 with consumption of marijuana, and I don't even know why, but what they do. Maybe somebody could fully explain that to me. But anyway, when people talk about 420, they always think about marijuana. But there's a lot of conversation, and especially from mainstream politicians. John Boehner, who was always staunchly against. Especially recreational marijuana, but he was against medical marijuana. He was totally against marijuana and was all for the criminalization and ignored the fact that the criminalization of marijuana disproportionately affected people of color over white people, even though white people smoke marijuana every bit as much, perhaps even more than people of color. But so Boehner was staunchly against it. Now in his private life, now that he's not a congressman anymore, he seems, he's lined himself up. Well, he was always lined up with the tobacco lobby, as Jake was mentioning to me during the break, which is part of the reason I guess he was against it. But now the tobacco industry is now taking a shine to looking at marijuana. So now all of a sudden John Boehner's done a flip, and he's totally supporting this idea of his industry that that has been funding him for many years, advancing recreational marijuana. But now we hear Charles Schumer, from senator from New York State, advocating this thing, and obviously other folks. I mean, two of the folks that are running for governor, Joel Giamber, who I had on my show actually in New York, and Cynthia Nixon. These are both candidates that people could argue are the outsiders. Nixon trying to challenge Cuomo in the primary, and although Jambra isn't trying to take on some of the establishment field for the GOP nomination, he is running on a Reform Party ticket, which is considered more of a conservative line on a ballot. And both those guys are endorsing this the legalization of marijuana. Now, but I will say, Cynthia Nixon is the only person who I've heard say part of the reason that she adopts this as a platform item is because of the social justice issue. Because let's face it, unlike alcohol, where some of the people who were fully engaged in the illegal or illicit alcohol trade during Prohibition, and were allowed to continue to be involved in the alcohol industry when Prohibition was lifted. And the Kennedys come to mind. Joe Kennedy comes to mind. But not Joe Kennedy alone. But these guys who kept the alcohol industry going in the black market easily stepped back into the legal alcohol market when Prohibition was lifted. But that's not really the way it's playing out with many of the conversations as it relates to cannabis, to marijuana. There are a disproportionate number of people of color in prison today for smoking, dealing, low-level dealing, possession of marijuana. A disproportionate number of people of color. White people smoke weed as much, like I said, or more than people of color, but certainly as much. And you know what? They're even arrested at a fairly, even level. Really, I mean, or at least stopped, or charged originally. But they always seem to dispose of their charges much more efficiently and never face the same kind of time that people of color do. And of course, this is as much of a class issue and a financial issue as much as anything. But that's kind of Cynthia Nixon's view on this thing: is the decriminalization of marijuana should release a bunch of people who are in prison currently for their place in the industry that all of a sudden is going to get a whitewashing. And it will get a whitewashing. I guarantee it's going to be much harder for people of color who may be dealing today while it's still illegal. And I don't mean just black people in urban areas. I mean Native people, brown people, all over are going to have a harder time establishing themselves in a legal marijuana trade than white people are going to. And if that sounds unreasonable, what I'm saying, then you're just not really considering, the facts thoroughly. I mean, so that's part of the problem. And that leads me to something that I've never really said before on the show. Look, one of my sponsors, and I've had Tim Barnhart on my show from Talladega, talked about the dispensary issue. Look, and I want to be clear, I'm not a fan of substance abuse, and I'm not a fan of tobacco use, and I don't mean substance abuse, but even alcohol. Whether you consider the alcohol consumption a substance abuse issue or just, I'm not a big fan of drinking or smoking. But having said that, I will defend our right to sell and be in the tobacco industry. I will defend our right to be in the alcohol business. I mean, and so whether that's a casino serving alcoholic beverages or like a Monaco-Sassy where they actually have laws or regulations or some sort of, again, you can sell alcohol in Aquasasi. At least you could. I don't know if you still can or not. But so I think our right to be involved in that business and carve out our own manner of being in that business is something that is that we have a right to do. I mean, and not just, I'm not going back to the Cabazon thing saying, well, if it's legal in the state, it should be legal in territories. But I'm not saying that should necessarily be the case. But if it worked for gaming, it should hold up in court on some of these other enterprises. Now, brings us to cannabis and to marijuana. Honestly, I applaud the guys out in Talladega, not just Legacy 420, but all of the guys who have said, you know what, legal recreational marijuana is coming to Canada. There's no reason for us to wait and B, just catch what drops off the table. There's no reason for us not to be on the forefront of this thing. And I'm at the place now where I'm saying, why not here? Why not on native territories? I mean, look, I've advocated in more than once, this idea that hemp production should be something that we pursue. But you know what? If all of these white guys are talking about legalizing recreational marijuana, then why aren't we doing it on our territories? And you know what? Let's take the challenge. We had to fight for tobacco. We had to fight for selling gas without tax. We had to fight for gaming. Let's not forget, Barry Snyder had to plead out some charges for having slot machines down at the Seneca Hawk, and he's the chairman of the Seneca Gaming Corporation right now. He was the president. He's been the at least 5 times elected the president of the Seneca Nation. So why not jump on the forefront of this thing? Maybe it is time. Maybe it's time for people to embrace that this is an industry that's coming. Well, and look, I know I'm still concerned about being guarded about promoting substance abuse. I think smoking marijuana is safer than consuming alcohol. I've never heard of anybody, really, I've never heard anybody dying of smoking marijuana. I've heard people dying consuming alcohol, drinking too much. And of course, there's driving while intoxicated is much more of an issue when you're overly intoxicated on alcohol than smoking weed. So, but I am concerned about that. And maybe there's some, I would not necessarily suggest that we just sell bags of weed. I would think it would make more sense to have a value-added product that is offered for sale. So maybe it is a marijuana cigarette, maybe with a filter to keep some of that tar from getting into your lungs. And it's not going to stop carbon monoxide, but certainly a filter would catch some of the tar. I don't know. I mean, look, smoking is still going to be bad for your lungs. Even marijuana, it's going to be bad for your lungs. I mean, not as bad as tobacco, but it's still, if you breathe smoke in, I don't care if it's smoke from leaves, if it's from grass clippings, if it's from tobacco, or if it's from marijuana, it's probably not going to be good for you. But I also think there's other products. I mean, there are consumables, there's oils, there's any number of products, edibles for that matter, that can that would give a value added, a value beyond just the raw material. And so maybe the idea of just selling bags of weed shouldn't be the focus. But I think the idea of creating a responsible, and when I say responsible, I mean, let there be some level of testing so people know what they're getting. I mean, whether it's hemp oil that has no THC in it, or whether it's recreational marijuana that has a certain level. I mean, the last thing we need is people. I mean, I just saw something today. Some people who got sick or even died smoking this synthetic marijuana, which is really advertised as incense, not really as a smokable or consumable product, but it's kind of a euphemism, I guess, for it when they call it incense. But no, I think something that is that has some sort of standard. And I don't know how you especially here on territory, we would create that standard for marijuana. But I also think there's a certain level of self-regulation, and I know people think I'm insane when I say that, but I think if there were opportunities, and again, it's one thing for somebody to grow a few plants and roll their own and that kind of stuff in their house and that kind of stuff, which I don't think this should be a problem. But I think if you're putting together a multi-million-dollar operation, I think being held to a standard so people know that you're selling a safe product and a product that is properly labeled and that kind of stuff. I think we could do that. But you know what? Why not do it? Why wait until a bunch of pharmaceutical companies or the tobacco industry that loved us to death when we were selling their product, but then hated our guts when we started developing our own brands? Why should we let them run away with the market? And that's all I'm saying. So maybe we should be out in the forefront. Maybe we should do like the folks in Tandanega and step out there. That's, again, you know, my own daughter's probably like scratching her head thinking, is this my father saying this? maybe both my daughters and my son are scratching their head. And look, and I'm not advocating use of marijuana, just like I'm not advocating the use of tobacco. But I gotta say, if it's an industry that's out there, and it certainly is, then should it be one that we ignore? Again, I'm not looking to, for another fight necessarily, but it is an opportunity. I think there are other things. I think along the lines with marijuana is the medical purposes. And there are many. There are reasons for using a variety of products that come from hemp or marijuana. Everything from anti-seizure meds to sleeping aids to ways of combating depression. There's even a fairly reasonable school of thought and literature out there suggesting that marijuana use could be a better, can be used not only as a better alternative to heroin and cocaine, but could actually be create different pathways, neurological pathways that would help undo those addictions. There's a lot of evidence that suggests alcohol is more of a gateway drug to hard drugs than marijuana is. I would argue it makes more sense to smoke a joint than it does to smoke a cigarette, because at least you got something. There's more value out of smoking a marijuana cigarette than a tobacco one. I know you get nicotine and you get a certain sensation from it, but from what I understand, and I got to say, I have to say, from what I understand, I don't partake, okay? But I got to think there's a better sensation smoking a joint than smoking a cigarette. I just assume so. Otherwise, it wouldn't be as popular as it is, even as illegal as it is. So, that's my view. So, look, people can condemn me because, oh yeah, see, there he went, he got a sponsor, and now he sold his soul. Look, I'm not saying this for any other purpose than the fact that this is coming, folks. This is coming. Legal marijuana. Obviously it's legal in a bunch of states already. In fact, you could pretty much order this stuff from those states. There's somebody in California or Oregon or Colorado who will send you this stuff if you want it. And, it's still considered illegal in New York State. I'm just not sure if it's illegal in Seneca Nation or if it's legal in Mohawk territory, or if it's illegal in native territories. And I think that's a fight that ultimately we're going to have. And again, I'm all for drawing a very, very, very firm line in the sand on heroin, fentanyl, cocaine, and any number of meth, crystal meth, all of that stuff. I'm just not so sure that marijuana reaches that that class of drug that should be so heavily enforced. And I've got friends who went to jail over this stuff. And I know plenty of people who have been busted for this stuff. And you know what? There's a part of me that said, why? Why would you take that risk? And and part of the reason it was a risk is because it was so clearly criminalized, but at some point it is becoming less clearly criminalized. And so, what's being talked about isn't just the legalization, but the decriminalization of it. And so, hey, the Seneca Nation has already passed a resolution authorizing or a resolution pursuing medical marijuana. And let's be honest here. There isn't a criminal code here in the Seneca Nation. Honestly, there's only one prohibition that really exists in Seneca Nation as per Seneca law, and that's the sale of alcohol, which the Seneca Nation is kind of sidestepped because they sell alcohol in their gaming facilities, and of course there's alcohol. A couple of stores down in Salamanca in particular, do our beverage centers and that kind of stuff. So. But there is no laws on the books. They have more stringent regulatory enforcement on tobacco than they do anything else. It's not enforced, but they have it and they've created it and and some of it's a little absurd. But I mean, they actually, I don't know, for those who aren't familiar with Seneca territory, they actually have cars that run around, and they call them import-export officers, and they look like cop cars. And, I kind of poke fun at them. I call them the tobacco police. But they're kind of like Barney Fife. They don't really have a bullet in their gun. But anyway, I mean, I'm not trying to make fun of anybody. But I think there needs to be a more of an open discussion, and maybe not, I'm not saying the Seneca Nation has to necessarily legislate this, because again, I don't think they have anything on the books that prohibits it anyway. And their marshal service are not extensions of the outside police like the Akwesasne, or the St. Regis tribal police are, which are really just state officers. So we could make the solid case against state law applying here or federal law applying here as it relates to cannabis. So maybe it's time. Maybe it's time that somebody stepped up. And I know there's probably people willing to do it, but maybe it's time that maybe somebody's going to open up a store here, on territory, and it's going to be a dispensary, and it'll be interesting to see how that's handled. I know I just heard recently. I know the Seneca Nation tried to be firm in their paraphernalia, their drug paraphernalia requirements or regulations, and which I think at some point you got to question. Look, a pipe you can be used to smoke anything, right? I mean, I guess I would agree with discouraging crack pipes, and that kind of stuff, but I gotta think the marijuana thing's gotta lighten up a little bit, and I think people are gonna have to reconsider that place. And again, what's gonna happen if you don't address it is that you're gonna get run over by the outside. We utilized our regulatory advantages to carve out a place in the tobacco industry that ultimately led to us having native brands. We didn't start out with this way. I mean, we were selling the same product that, R.J. Reynolds product, Philip Morris product, Marlboros, Newports, Winstons. That's the stuff that we were selling. Generic brands from the major tobacco companies. And we just, we marketed the fact that we didn't pay or charge New York State tax. Well, before this turns into a highly regulated and highly taxed industry and then trying to play catch up later, maybe we should establish, why wait? I guess that's the question. I know what the old expression says, it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. I'm not even sure that we need to ask for forgiveness, but this is part of the challenge. So anyway, I figure I'd honor the date 4/20 with at least that conversation. Hey, look, just before I go, I do have to say, I did wear my Hawaii shirt. For those of you who see it, Eastside Pride shirt. I don't have one specifically for Kauai, but I got to tell you, I mentioned this on the show. They had a major flooding event in Kauai. And in case you don't understand how major a flooding event it was, they literally had over 28 inches of rain in a 24-hour period. Now think about that. When we have 28 inches of snow, it's a major event here, even in Western New York, and we get that all the time, right? Think about how much water 28 inches of water is. And look, and the people who suffer the most anytime something like this happens are the people who couldn't afford that suffering the least. So again, my thoughts, my concerns. I have posted on my Facebook page a link to how you can support the people in Kauai who are suffering. And as more of those crowdsourced funding events take place, I'll promote them as well. But I mean, reach out, find out, look online, find out what happened there first. You have to be aware of it, right? So look at the flooding in Kauai. It's completely devastating. And I have lots of friends and people that I've gotten close with over the years who are the Kanaka Maoli, the traditional people of Hawaii, and and my thoughts are with them deeply. I in fact, I'm a regular guest on Kauai Community Radio and the program Songs of Sovereignty. So haven't been in a while, but I'm waiting for things to settle down. Maybe I'll join my good friend Kalanui out there with that again. Kailani, I'm sorry, on that program. All right, that about wraps up. We'll be back here on Monday, and I'll talk a little bit about what I got going on in New York coming up in next week as well. I'm showing a film called Man versus Ford. You can check some of that out on my pages as well. But goodbye for now. This is John Kane, and we'll see you on Monday. Yahweh.
Red